This is Art Sense, a podcast focused on educating and informing listeners about the past, present, and future of art. I'm Craig Gould. On today's episode, I speak with artist James Welling, whose most recent photographs will be featured in an exhibition titled Thought Objects at David Zwirner's 533 West 19th Street location in New York, January 11th to February 10th. Welling has long challenged traditional ideas of what photography can be. And in this latest work, he continues this pursuit by utilizing digital tools in unconventional ways to create works that avoid categorization. And now, a discussion about building images with photographer James Welling. James Welling, thank you so much for joining me this week on the Art Sense podcast. James, I wanted to talk to you because you have a show coming up at David Zwirner, Thought Objects. It opens January 11th at Zwirner's 533 West 19th Street location in New York. And James, a lot of times with artists, I like to start with a hypothetical, and that is, let's say you're sitting down at a dinner party next to someone who has absolutely no idea who you are or what your work consists of. Where do you start to describe it?
Well, that's a good question, and it does happen. It just happened a few nights ago. I say that I'm a photographer, and there's a mild response, and then I say I photograph everything but people, which of course is not entirely true. I've done editorial photographs, portraits. But it's then I whip out my phone and I show them my website because it's actually challenging to sometimes at a dinner party explain what I do.
I imagine you've been asked that question over decades, and I think I'd be interested to know how people's preconceptions of your response has changed over the decades, because what people think of as what photography is, who photographers are, it's radically changed over the last 30, 40 years, right?
Yes. I talk to fewer civilians than you think. I mean, I usually, if I'm traveling, I'm next to my wife. She knows what I do. I generally downplay what I do when I'm talking to people. Either modesty or just I don't want to explain what I do because it's I'm very involved in the sort of nitty-gritty of photography at this point. It's not only technical, but I think a lot about the medium and sort of this ongoing dialogue. So to pick up and start telling someone what I'm thinking, I mean, this context where we're going to have 45 minutes is sufficient time to get into that, but it's really not something I like to do in a short period of time.
I think there are probably more people who think of themselves as photographers in this generation, with everyone carrying a camera in their pocket. But I think an interesting conversation for you is, the nature of photography over the course of your career. Your photography has ebbed and flowed from what we would think of as traditional photography to things that can really only be categorized as artworks, right? And Can you kind of tell us about, I believe I've heard you say before proudly that you never took a photography course. And so your eye comes to the medium maybe from a painter's perspective. Would you agree with that?
It comes from, I started out as a painter in high school, and there were a few intervening years when I was exploring video or sculpture or installation. So it wasn't like I dropped my painting tools and then picked up photography. There was a kind of almost every year I'd be looking at different contemporary forms of making work, and eventually at age 25, I realized that this sort of wandering, as it were, after I left painting, which has a kind of discipline, you could say, I wanted to latch on to something that had the discipline or history of a medium, painting being the obvious one. But I'd studied dance and sculpture, but photography seemed like something I could grab onto. And even though I never, quote, took a photo class, like everyone, I had help in the darkroom. I'd go in the darkroom and had an experience as a sophomore in college where someone showed me how to make a print. And then, with very rudimentary controls. And then in grad school, I spent a few more days in the darkroom with friends showing me how to work. So it's really that no formal education, but you have to have someone helping you. It's very hard to go from just book learning to that practice. So along the way, to this day, I am, like all photographers, picking up information about how to do something, and putting it into action.
Your undergraduate days were spent in Pittsburgh.
Mm-hmm.
At Carnegie Mellon. Warhol kind of looms over Pittsburgh from an arts perspective. There have been points in your career where you can see the influence of screen printing or the thought of printmaking. Were some of those seeds planted there in that area?
I took a foundation class, and we did all of the different print media, etching, woodcut, silkscreen. Of course, I was much more interested in the photocopy machine. So that as a print device is what I really got out of my experience at Carnegie Mellon, was just falling in love with the grayscale, the beautiful grays of early photocopy. And I don't have many of those left. And I did make paintings and sculptures, but in terms of today, how I address a photographic print, it's interesting that the Xerox machine, the photocopy machine, which was very early in its very early stages in 1970, was the printmaking device that I latched onto.
Did that have something to do with flattening the image and doing things with the contrast? Was that something that was, maybe the degradation? What was it about the photocopier that was really sparking your creativity?
Well, like a Polaroid process, you get an instant picture. The photocopy machine is very limited. You can bring materials to it, put them on the bed, and scan it. You can also scan books, which I did. I made drawings, pencil drawings, and scanned those. Put a mirror on the machine. I jumped up on the machine and put my ankles on it. I think probably my hands, but I do have images of my feet. It was all in one. You got a print. It was instant. So I think that was and the beautiful grayscale was what drew me to it. Interestingly, in 2019 and over the COVID shutdown, I made a lot of laser prints and altered them with oil paint. But I sort of went back to using these very simple electrostatic, as the technical term is, medium. And it's this, and just as a tiny footnote, while I was working away, kind of unbeknownst to any of the faculty, making Xerox prints, my painting teacher, Connie Fox, was about to go up to Rochester, and she worked for the color Xerox machine. I only discovered this recently, that Xerox or photocopy, color photocopy, became a big thing in Rochester, and a lot of women were doing stuff, men and women, up at the Visual Studies workshop. So by working with laser prints, I began to investigate the history of electrostatic printmaking.
So it sounds like the immediacy was a big attraction to you. And so maybe that's a great lead in to talking about how how photography has changed in the last 20, 30 years in terms of digital photography, your ability to have an immediate response to what you're photographing, or, in your case, probably, I imagine once you started getting your hands on digital editing tools, that had a big influence on your work.
Well, the digital revolution for me hit in maybe mid 90s. I bought a scanner. This is before I had a digital camera. And I began to work with color. And digital represented, at least in the late 90s, early 2000s, a release from the kind of tyranny of analog color, which is a very, very hard to control, very limited. Digital presented this possibly open situation where you could work with color with a lot more freedom than you could on the analog side. So when I embraced digital, it was really to work in color, which up until that point I had not. I'd made a few Type C prints, but it was always very trying to go to the rental darkroom and to try to figure out how to make a passable C print or work with a Polaroid studio to make a large Polaroid. So digital freed me. I was still making, oh, actually, I started making digital prints right away from those scans, but the camera came much later. The first really 5 years or 7 years was scanners and digital printing. I was fortunate. I started teaching at UCLA, where I had access to some hardware that I probably would not have had. And I was also had graduate students who could, we were all figuring out how to make digital photographs, digital prints, and then digital capture. So it was a kind of a communal effort back in the beginning of digital uh, image and printmaking, where we were all trying to figure it out. And there were 6 ways to Monday to do something. And so we would share and um, read and try to figure it out.
It feels like you also reached a point where things began to unlock for you with color, and you started working more with filters and the separation of color and what it's like to piece those separations back together. Was there
Mhm.
was there a particular aha moment, or was it just a slow progression?
That was a very slow progression. I was familiar with color separations because my father worked for a printing company, and uh, he worked for a year, uh, journeyman year on working offset machines, and then became a salesman. But he was always had his linen tester, his loop, and he would look at to make sure the screens were registered. So as a kid, I understood that mechanical reproductions use separations. Then at Carnegie Mellon, a student friend, very capable photographer, told me about the dye transfer process, which I didn't really understand. Took me a number of years to figure out what he was describing. And by the time digital came along, I had taken these very early insights, separations, and sort of what's known as assembly color dye transfer, where you assemble a color photograph. And that really helped figure out what I was going to do with digital. As I said, it unlocked color, which I had never really thought about before that point.
Well, I think that's around the period when you took some really amazing photographs for the first time of the glass house.
Mhm.
Can you talk a little bit about that project?
So I'd made some photographs. I wanted to sort of draw the curtain back from what happens in our eyes. We have red, green, and blue sensors, and that those light waves are mixed in the brain. So I made some photographs using color negatives and red, green, and blue filters, which sort of shows you the sort of fringe colors where the separations don't line up. I went to the glass house thinking I would do that. I wanted to photograph. I was already interested in photographing modernist architecture, living in Los Angeles, all of these great case study houses. And so I went to the glass house thinking I would sort of repeat what I'd done in Los Angeles. But it turned out that what I was I needed wind. I needed shadows moving. The glass house was actually completely inappropriate for the tools that I brought. And but I had 3 days on site to photograph it for New York Magazine. And the third day, I took out my digital camera and started experimenting with not the red, green, and blue filters, but just single filters. So I made some reddish images and some greenish images. Liked those. Went back, got rid of the idea of just making separations, and I began to experiment with just a strange array of colored filters, and then eventually colored glass and diffraction gratings, all kinds of things that I could stick in front of my lens to distort the image. So these glass house photographs were made in front of the camera, no manipulation in post. And so I think I made a dozen trips over 3 years to the glass house, taking more and more stuff to put in front of my lens.
Yeah, I think what's obvious in that work is that the different colors tend to have different emotive properties. It seems consistent with what Johnson, I think, was probably attracted to with the work, is that the house and its surroundings are always changing with light. They're always changing with season. And in a lot of ways, capturing it in each of those different color variations provides a different emotive property, right?
At a certain point, I wanted to, yes, bring in as many different possible colors and just have this array of different spectral colors. What was really fascinating, and I think anyone who really has worked in the color darkroom or is really serious about color, the experience, what I experienced was I would work with the strangest colors, purples or oranges or these spectra that I would get from diffraction gratings. And then I would see those same colors in a magazine, an optical effect of light in a flower vase. It was the strangest thing. I could use the most unnatural colors at the glass house. And then when I came back to California and started printing them, I would see those colors as not unnatural because I was seeing them in my everyday life. That is, you become attuned to color palette. And this has happened with other color projects where I think I'm just doing the most disconnected colors from experience, and then I begin to see them. So it's about this, I'm not expressing it very elegantly. It's sort of working with materials that then you see them everywhere.
I've heard people say that they thought they were buying a really rare automobile, and as soon as they, sign on the dotted line, they see 20 or 30 of them on the street
Right.
every day. You just never,
Right.
you never noticed before, right? Your description of the color, I really have to ask. Can you tell me about your class at Princeton, pathological color? What is the discussion there with your students?
Well, I've taught this class on and off for maybe 20 years. It's been variously a seminar. We do a lot of reading on color. This semester it was more practice based. But Goethe, I took the title pathological color from his theory of colors. And when you were talking about how certain glasshouse photographs have its emotive density, and this is something that Goethe talks about. You put a red filter, you look through red glass, and the landscape becomes tragic and stormy. So the Goethe is sort of foundational, but then we read books, texts on physiological experience of color, cultural experiences of color. Even Goethe talks about this, the propensity for certain geographic regions to favor certain colors. And then this semester, it evolved into a sort of timeline of historic color processes. So we looked at and tried to replicate digitally by modeling them or sort of creating them in the digital environment. The earliest color photographs, which are tricolor, three color separations, late 19th century. The autochrome, which is 1905-ish. The Lumiere brothers in France just invented this really revolutionary color process. It's very ungainly, but it interestingly becomes the model for the digital sensor. And then dye transfer. So we either modeled them, or in the case of dye transfer, we were able to make some very crude dye transfer prints. So it's this iteration of the class was more practice, but maybe next time I teach it, it'll be more of a seminar and reading about color. When I taught it at UCLA, we would keep color diaries. So the students would write down their experiences of color, and then I'd sort of lightly edit them, and then we'd print them all out at the end of the semester. So it's really about this, about the becoming very sensitive, sensitized to our experience of color and how it functions in photography.
Yeah, you know what? One of the things that I've been very intrigued by before is, and there's a great infographic at a website that I referred to in a previous episode called "Information is Beautiful." And at this website, one of the infographics, it's an analysis of what meaning is tied to specific colors in different cultures around the world. White kind of connotates the same, purity and peace anywhere in the world, and black, is tied to death. But there are some colors that their impression in one culture is radically different than another. Whether that is in Japan, yellow being the color of mourning with a U, death.
Mhm.
I've always found that really intriguing, how there are some of those impressions that are universal, and in others where it's not. Is that something you guys have looked at in terms of cross culturally, how colors are interpreted and responded to?
No, not really, because yes, we get it in Goethe, and we read an essay by Michael Tausig, but in a way, that's I would leave that to the non-technical people, the comp lit people or the anthropologists. I mean, most people do not understand how photographs are made, and that is my sort of mission in this class. And uh, in the show at David Zwirner, I really zero in on and take a deep dive into how um, certain technical tools in photography are used. I spent some time talking to a computer scientist at Princeton, and he had some incredible stuff to share with me about the machine learning classes he was teaching and his interest in photography. But I did find it a little surprising that he had no sense of the history of photography. He did not know about autochrome. He did not know about some of the analog tools that the digital tools that we use are actually modeled on and based on. And the real amazing thing is he didn't understand that photography was chemistry. We understand photography as physics, and we can understand image formation, but the chemistry of photography, I'm not a chemist. I'm in awe of the chemistry of, that Kodak and Fuji and Agfa have created for us. But it's absolutely stunning that the chemical world, even the animal world, gelatin being a component of photography, this is the stuff that I wanted to begin to talk about in the class rather than the cultural, which is of course super important, but that's not my skill set. I want to look at the materials of photography.
Some of the best work doesn't necessarily have to rely heavily on technology, right? Because you're the work that you were doing with photograms, and the work where you were using window screens.
Mhm.
Those are very basic processes, but the outputs are rather magical, right?
Interesting that you mentioned the my screen photographs from the early 2000s. The work at David Zwirner, there's a big component of it, maybe half of the show is about screen interference that occurs that I'm working with and manipulating the screen of either digital dot patterns or the screen created by the grain of analog film. I've been obsessed with screens, as has Liz Deschênes. She did some work with halftone screens, but I've been obsessed with halftone screens and now just more generally the phenomenon of screens and moires and how images are built up with this sort of lattice tessellation that creates the photograph. So in this Zwirner show, I'm manipulating the screens or taking them in a direction that most people don't go, where you see the moire patterns and interference rather than the sort of hidden sharpening tools.
That's interesting. Part of the conversation I was having recently about advent of machine learning, AI, and the imagery that is coming out of these algorithms. Part of that conversation was about how there is an inclination for those images to sort of get slicker and slicker, and what you wind up losing is a lot of the degradation that is in the artist's hand or in the materials in the process. Totally. Can you kind of talk about the beauty of degradation and kind of the challenges there?
Well, you could say that these AI images that are being created from verbal prompts, it's obvious they have no basis in quote reality, but they have no granular structure, or they have no errors, or no glitches, or no seams showing, which is one of the things that 20th century art was keenly interested in. Was you can go back to Cezanne, his kind of patches of light that don't add up. I mean, the problem with AI is that it's only focuses on making convincing representations, whereas the art of the last the modernist period is not about convincing representations. It's about challenging representation. It's both depressing AI. I've been using it to a smaller degree to polarize black and white photographs, and I could probably do it. I mean, I'm using AI and hand coloring techniques, not in any serious way. I'm just experimenting with it, but it's pretty low level right now. I had hoped that the neural filters in Photoshop, they had taken the color temperature of every object on the planet Earth, so they would see, and it worked with a red tractor. They see red tractors, so they get the color absolutely right. But for a modernist building made out of aluminum and glass, they kind of go back and forth between half of it is reddish and half of it is greenish. It's like the algorithm is really out there. It doesn't quite know what to do with it.
That's why you're here, right? To help it discern,
to provide feedback.
Exactly. Let's talk a little bit more about this show that is coming up, the thought objects. There's the subject matter in a lot of the pieces kind of goes back to your roots in taking photos of architecture, right? Mm-hmm. Is there a particular attraction to that as a subject matter, or is there an attraction in terms of it being a blank slate or something that you can... It's a handy surface for manipulating what you want to manipulate?
Well, yeah, it is an armature for certain thought objects, as it were, so certain thinking about both the subject, this building, and also how it's the tools that the photographer uses to get it in front of you. And then it becomes, as I said, with the glass house, an armature that I can layer ideas on. So it becomes a sort of a laboratory. I mean, I'm not, when I first saw, let's say, Stephen Shore's work or New Topographics, I was very taken by it. And I made my own versions of those sorts of subjects in Los Angeles in the late 70s. And I was learning how to take photographs, but there was nothing there that was, to me, my work. I was doing someone else's style. And now, however much I love people like Walker Evans or the new topography, or even the Beschers and the Dusseldorf school, street photography, all of those modalities of making images, that's not my calling. I don't think that way, and I'm a little bored by it. Ultimately, it doesn't say much to me, apart from the subject speaking. So, there's photographers who are dealing with ecological crises or other issues around neoliberalism in the surface of our world, and that's absolutely great. It's just not what I do. So I'm by titling the work Thought Objects, which is a reference to a publication that Glenn Branca and Barbara S. put out in 1987. It's a book of 125 photographs. Uh, I just love the idea of almost like a philosopher's stone, photograph being this thing to contemplate. So, what am I going to photograph? I am drawn to modernist architecture in part because it reminds me of the workings of the camera. There's these boxes. And so you have this little box on one side, and then you have this other box that you're photographing. So maybe half of the show, a third of the show, are modernist and also some pre-modernist buildings that I'm doing these experiments with, draping them with my ideas, repainting them.
Yeah, it's interesting you say painting. Like right now, I have pulled up one of the images from the show, which is it's a particular location. It's a building, and it's been kind of cut into strata and reassembled into this kind of
Yeah.
mix
Is it?
of
It's kind of grayish in the middle. Is it
yes,
the? Yeah, it's the Louis Kahn Salk Institute.
and it reminds me how when I'm talking to someone about learning how to paint, and in this generation, people are always looking at photo references, and you have to remind someone that yes, this is a photo reference of what you're wanting to paint, but our eye doesn't look at something the way a photograph captures it. Our eye picks points, and we focus on this and this and this, and then there's an overall impression versus a photograph, a typical photograph, everything's in focus. And what's interesting about this image, the way you've deconstructed and reconstructed it, you're getting more of an emotional impression of a place because you're almost giving us those incremental things that we focused on instead of everything in focus.
That's a great read. Yeah, I never thought of it that way. It's those were some of the very first works for this show that I began a few years ago, and just really simple. Cut up different views of the same building and reassemble them. And because the, I'm not very sophisticated with digital cutting, I just did these strips, and it's interesting that it's about you see it as a sort of focus because it's true. What each one of the panels looks at and makes a sort of composition from different elements in the building.
I'm looking at another one here, which it almost feels like it goes back to what you're talking about with flatbed scanning. It's a floral image that almost looks like a pressed photo,
Mm-hmm.
with greenery in the background, and the pressed floral. It takes me back to high school when I had a biology teacher in high school that made us collect 50 different varieties of wildflower in our area and press them. And I look at this that it looks like a primrose or something, and it takes me back there. But it's there's a really interesting juxtaposition between what almost looks like an impasto oil painting juxtaposed with what would be a traditional view of the flora that kind of goes with it.
This these there are three. I've created three sort of bas relief, well, more than three, but for the show, I have three bas relief images of flowers, and I discovered that there are these sharpening tools in analog and also in digital called unsharp masking, which you don't want to see. It's something that photographers or offset printers, they'll sharpen an image sufficiently, but you keep it below the sort of level of visual awareness. But if you go a little farther, you get this bas relief effect that I thought was just inherent in this sharpening and over sharpening, which I found extremely interesting. That with one image can make it look dimensional. I've realized that this is one of the tricks that when you reproduce paintings, you do this to get the brushstrokes to be a little bit more assertive than they would be in a straight photograph. So this is like a trick that offset printers, and I'm sure for other subjects besides painting, ever so slight misalignment of the sharpening layer produces this exaggeration of the texture. But as humans, we're uh, predisposed to see texture. This is something that our physiological makeup of vision is to be very sensitive to texture. And of course, this is something that digital, quote, virtual reality really falls short on. So it's also a kind of a critique of virtual reality, which like I'm still waiting for them to understand how to do texture, which is probably impossible. And it's just a small step from those bas relief pictures to these other images, which are a lot noisier. Um, in a way, the bas relief pictures are a sort of echo. And as I began to work or get more deeply involved in thinking about this sharpening process, I forget where I read some little snippet that techniques of Photoshop, visual digital processing, um, descends from, was preceded by audio processing. So the tools of a sound engineer, digital tools, were developed before Photoshop and before image making digitization. So we used the vocabulary of sound to describe some of these tools. For instance, a grainy photograph is referred to as noisy.
Hmm.
And there are these things called high and low pass filters in Photoshop, but those are filters that are used in audio processing. And this bas relief that I'm creating is a sort of echo. It's a very kind of slight reverb in the picture. I mean, visually, reverb becomes bas relief.
Sure.
So this has been part of my discovery and working on this exhibition. Uh, I was sort of vaguely aware of this, but now I'm really into this sort of echo and the reverb of the digital tools.
Are these prints always on, surfaces that are clean, or do you ever experiment with surfaces that bring texture to the piece in terms of the material that it's being printed on?
I'm printing on very smooth pieces of aluminum, so not in this case, but the technology UV printing is designed to print on low relief, so I could be printing on textured materials. I That would involve a level of anti-illusion or illusion that I
Hmm.
thought it was simpler at this point to keep it all on a smooth surface because there is a feeling of relief that is illusory, and I'd rather keep it that way for now.
James, I really appreciate the time you've given me today to talk to you about your journey and this show that's coming up at Zwirner, Thought Objects. That opens January 11th. Will it be there, through the spring? Do you know?
It's up till February 11th or 10th, so it's up for a month, and hope people can see it. Very excited about it.
I really love your work. I love the work you did several years back. Choreograph, thought it was just beautiful, beautiful work, and it's been a real honor to get to sit down and kind of pick your brain about image making.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity and hope to see you at the opening.
That's all the time we have for this week. You've been listening to ArtSense. You can find the show on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher Radio, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. If you've enjoyed this podcast, be sure to subscribe. And while you're there, please rate the show and leave a quick review. Your feedback is the key to other folks finding us. And if you'd like to see images related to the conversation, read the transcript, and find other bonus features, you can go to canvia.art and click on the podcast tab. If you'd like to reach out to me, you can email me at craig@canvia.art. Thanks for listening.